total production has stayed fairly constant. That is because during that period, lamb growth rates to weaning have increased by about 50 grams per day. We're producing heavier carcasses by about 3 kilos, and we've increased the lambing percentage of our flock. And that has allowed us to maintain our performance overall. So the focus of my talk and presentation is to talk about some of the work that's been undertaken in New Zealand that's allowed us to achieve that performance. And I'm going to focus on multiple bearing ewes and pregnant ewe lambs or hoggets. And I'm going to focus mainly on the pregnancy and lactation period. And some of the facts and figures I show, or the recommendations I give, will be probably slightly different than what would be required in the Uruguayan environment. As Nicholas pointed out yesterday, our environments are different. However, the principles will be the same. And while I'm going to focus on nutrition and body condition scoring and some other techniques, I do not cover genetics, but genetics also underpins performance. And that has been presented by previous speakers. So just to start with some basic relationships, we know that as the height of the pasture or the feed that you give your sheep increases, their intake increases. It doesn't increase in a linear rate. As height gets greater, you get a smaller increase in intake before there's no further increase. And in our ryegrass white clover systems, we've determined that if pasture masses don't go below 1,200 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, and we measure that to the ground, or 4 centimetres in height, with our feed, we're never restricting intake. So that's the minimum cover if you want to maximise performance. At the other end of the scale, we know in summer and in autumn, if the pasture gets above 9 centimetres, we start to lose quality, and while intake may not be restricted, the amount of food they consume or the energy will be. So our optimum window for grazing in New Zealand is between 9 and 4 centimetres. I don't know if that's the same or different, or if that's been determined for Uruguay. Georgette showed a similar photo yesterday with a fence. One side, the pasture is too short and performance will be poor. The other side, the pasture is adequate from an intake perspective. When we're thinking about what an animal consumes, we want to ensure they fill their mouth every bite. So that's making sure in our environment we don't graze below 4 centimetres, and we allow them the ability to choose their diet. Sheep are the same as you. At lunchtime, none of you just choose one thing to eat. You mix your diet. Sheep mix their diet. It is only humans that think sheep want to eat one thing. And I'll show some data later. So you not only do you want sheep to be able to choose what they want to eat, you don't want to be able to restrict intake, and you need to ensure pasture quality is high. And this basic graph just shows as the ME, or the energy in the feed, increases along the bottom axis, lamb growth and the growth of young bulls increase. And when you think about pasture, good quality pasture in our environment, 4 to 9 centimetres, is 11, 12 megajoules. However, in summer and autumn, if the feed gets longer, gets mature, and you have the seed heads, the quality declines. You might think there's a lot of food there, but the energy for the animal is not there, so performance will be disappointing. Another simple relationship is body condition score, which is a subjective measure of body reserves. For all traits in sheep, there's this relationship. As body condition score increases, performance increases up until about a condition score 3 to 3.5. What that relationship allows you to do, and what our farmers are increasingly doing, is target. Like Sue said, target management. The ones that have the lower condition scores, those with a 2.5 and below, are the ones you want to feed the extra food to, because if you lift their body condition score, you will lift performance. The ones that have already got a condition score of 3 or 3.5, giving them extra food to put on more condition will not increase their performance. It's just inefficient and it costs you food. So you want to target that. And our farmers are encouraged to body condition score 4 times a year. So in the latter parts of my talk, I will talk about using that technology body condition score, combining with feeding to target those animals that need it the most. Because I'm not sure about Uruguayan farms, but on New Zealand farms, there is never enough food to meet the requirements of our sheep. That's the truth. So with the food we have, the cheapest food is grass or herbage, and therefore we want to target the food we have to those animals that will give us the biggest response, so we can be the most efficient we can be. And when it comes to feeding ewes that are pregnant, their feed requirement depends on those 4 factors that I'm sure you could tell me as well. And I'll also discuss that as the talk progresses. So as Sue indicated, in Australia, there's now a change in management of our farmers. They don't manage the flock or the mob as one. They split them at various times based on need. So it's based on the need of the individual, not on the flock, if you want to maximize performance, because you'll have a range within your flock. So a similar theme to what Sue was suggesting. And if I'd have asked you as an audience to give me what are the impacts or effects of poor feeding in pregnancy, we would probably come up with a list very similar to this. Poor feeding in pregnancy can affect the fetus, the lambs, and milk production. These can affect lamb weaning weights, and it can affect the weight of the ewe at weaning, because the weight of the ewe at weaning or her body condition will affect her performance the next year. And remember, on a farm, you're dealing with a system. So you need to be thinking about feeding for those 3 factors. Feeding to ensure we get good survival, good growth, and that next year the ewe will perform for you again. So we'll touch on that as well. So I'm going to start my presentation in early pregnancy and finish after weaning. And I'm going to give some principles based on the research undertaken in New Zealand, and I will give some target pasture covers, but as I said, in your farming systems, they are probably different. But the principles will be the same. So, what our farmers are advised to do is during the breeding period to put harnesses, mating harnesses, on the rams, which is an old technology, and then ewes at the end of mating, which don't have a mark on their back, should be sold because they are going to consume herbage that is not going to result in a lamb for you. Also, farmers should body condition score their ewes just prior to breeding. So after breeding, they know which are the thin ewes, because they are the ones in early pregnancy. If you have extra feed, you should be giving it to them so that they can gain some body conditions in that period. Because as I'll show later on, most sheep can't eat their requirement in late pregnancy and lactation just based on pasture. So they have to rely on the fat. So the only time they can put on the fat is in early and mid-pregnancy. So by targeting thin ewes then, and also targeting the fatter ones, and just not feeding them too much, you can save feed. 80% of our farmers pregnancy scan with ultrasound now. And the information they collect is normally they identify non-pregnant ewes, ewes carrying 1, 2, or 3 lambs. And increasingly, they are also now asking the scanning technician to identify ewes that are pregnant early in the breeding period or late in the breeding period. Because all those 3 bits of information, pregnant or not, number of fetuses, early or late pregnancy, all affect feeding requirements. So the advantages of those bits of information, again, enables our farmers to sell the non-pregnant animals. It identifies those that are going to be twin-bearing, and therefore those that will need the most feed in late pregnancy and lactation, so we can target feeding them in late pregnancy. It identifies single-bearing ewes, because if feed is short in that late pregnancy period, lactation period, we can control their intakes, and the effect on their performance is not as great. It allows us to think about our paddock selections from a lamb survival perspective. Paddocks with shelter are the ones we want to target with twin-bearing ewes. And as I indicated, if you know which ewes are late lambing, you can control their intake or reduce their intake for longer, saving feed or targeting feed to those that need it most. And just to show you the importance of body condition score at pregnancy scanning, this is an old graph from 1990. Along the bottom axis is intake in megajoules, and along the horizontal axis is milk production, and each of those lines represents different body condition scores. The dark line being body condition score 4, and the lightest line being body condition score 1. And what this graph shows is that when there's lots of food, well, then body condition score does not influence milk production. But when feeding levels or the amount of food available is low, which is the case on most farms, if we're honest, in late pregnancy and lactation, body condition score can have up to a litre a day effect on milk production. So that's why you don't want your twin-bearing ewes to be of low body condition score. If you want your lambs to live, and you want your lambs to be 27, 28, 29, 30 kilos at weaning, because you want lots of milk. So at body condition scoring at pregnancy scanning, if she's twin-bearing or triplet-bearing, and she's in poor body condition, they're the ones you need to target. That's a simple relationship. So under our conditions, they would be we would say to farmers with ryegrass white clovers, don't let the ewes graze below 2.5 centimetres or 900 kilograms, and if you do that, she will gain weight at a rate equivalent to the requirement for pregnancy. Thin-bearing or thin ewes, poor body condition score ewes, you put them in a separate mob and don't let them graze as low. Because remember, the lower you graze, the smaller the bite size, therefore the less she will eat in 24 hours. Okay, so we have different cover targets based on body condition score in mid-pregnancy. And in mid-pregnancy, as farmers will already know when you're using in mid-pregnancy whether you're going to have enough grass in late pregnancy and lactation. You know that. You know what the grass looks like on a given day, and you know on average what you're likely to grow in the next 2 to 3 months. So you already know when you get to mid-pregnancy if you're going to have a problem. So mid-pregnancy, if you think you're going to have a problem, which are the sheep that you can restrict their intake? And they're your single-bearing ewes because they have enough ability to buffer when feed availability is low. And this is where the information on late lambing ewes becomes important. Because if the ewe is going to lamb 3 or 4 weeks later than the rest of her flock mates, why would you give her extra food now? And if you manage them together, the ewe that's lambing late will not say to the ewe that's lambing first, you eat it, I don't need it. You don't even do that at lunchtime. I've seen you eat. Everyone just eats what they want. In New Zealand, we also share in mid-pregnancy, but in New Zealand, as you'll be aware, most of our wool is above 30 microns. So we're sharing in mid-pregnancy, not from a wool quality perspective, but from a lamb survival and growth perspective. And so therefore, some of the decisions we make might be different than decisions you might make here in Uruguay. We know through studies that you will only get an increase in lamb survival from mid-pregnancy sharing if the lamb is heavier at birth. We also know you will only get a heavier lamb at birth if the ewe is a minimum of 2.5 body condition score at shearing. Because when you shear her, for fetal growth to be increased, she has to break down body fat. And that extra energy goes to the fetus. So if she's not fat, she's got nothing to break down. We also know that we don't want to make singleton lambs any bigger at birth. So therefore, using those 2 bits of information, our farmers often only share in mid-pregnancy the twin and triplet bearing ewes that are of good body condition. Because in our environment, it is difficult to shear in winter because they're wet. So the less animals you have to shear, the easier the management, and you'd only shear those where you get a response that's going to improve your profitability. Late pregnancy nutrition, again, that has been a number of studies in New Zealand have determined that, and under our conditions, in the last 10 days of pregnancy, if you've been following those previous feeding guidelines that I outlined, we don't graze below 1200 or 4 to 5 centimetres. And if you remember back to my second slide, I said in our conditions, if you don't graze below 1200, you're not restricting intake. So what we're saying there is in the last 10 days, don't restrict intake. If feed is short, and you can't do that for your whole flock, which is most farms in New Zealand, then we have a lower grazing cover for our singleton bearing ewes. We push them harder because they can cope. And again, our late lambing ewes that we've identified from pregnancy scanning, we hold them on the previous feeding guidelines for another 3 weeks because they do not need unrestricted feeding yet. If you give them unrestricted feeding, they will eat it, but you'll get no benefit, and the ewes that need it are missing out. This is a picture. A twin-bearing ewe, the week before lambing, if you have ryegrass white clover, has to eat 1.75 kilograms of dry matter a day. That's with an ME of 11 and 80% dry matter in the pasture. 80% water, 20% dry matter in the pasture. They have to eat that much in a day to meet her requirements. That is my boot. That is a big pile of grass. Now, that grass is very long because that's on a dairy cow farm, because we get our students as an exercise to cut it so they realise just how much food an animal needs. And if I did that with 4 centimetres, my students would be there all day. And I want to go home. But at 4 centimetres of grass, it's still the same pile. We have pushed our sheep so much by selecting for twins and triplets, we're pushing them to their physiological limit. Because remember, she's a ruminant, she has to graze it, chew it, swallow it, ruminate it, chew it, and swallow it again. So it is very difficult for our sheep to meet their requirements, and they often struggle. That's why body condition scoring and targeting those with poor condition is important, because they struggle to eat that in late pregnancy. Shelter is important, especially for lambing, in the lambing period. And our farmers target multiple or twin and triplet lambs because they're smaller, they're most susceptible. So those paddocks with most shelter, the ewes that are carrying twins or triplets are placed in them. And in our country, we have a lot more hills than you have. And they're also put in the flatter paddocks as well. But another bit of information you get from pregnancy scanning is you now know how many fetuses the ewe is carrying. And if you put in one paddock all your ewes with twins, so if you have 100 ewes in a paddock, they're all twins, there's 200 fetuses, or 200 potential lambs. Then at 6 to 7 weeks after lambing, and you're tailing or docking or removing their tails, all of our farmers like to know how many lambs, so they count how many tails. That then, counting the tails and knowing how many fetuses you had, gives you for each paddock the lamb survival for that paddock. And over a number of years, if you keep that information, you will quickly work out which paddocks are the best from a lamb survival point of view on your farm. It's an easy thing to do. And then you put your twins and triplets in those paddocks. It might be because of the way the wind goes across that paddock, the amount of shelter, there's a number of reasons. But pregnancy scanning helps you improve lamb survival as well. So that's a good tool for no extra cost, because you're pregnancy scanning from a nutritional point of view as well. So in lactation, as I said, the feeding guidelines in New Zealand are between that 2,000 and 1,200, because in summer, late spring, summer, if it's above 2,000 or that 9 centimetres, our pasture starts to lose quality, the ewe produces less milk, and lamb growth is not as good. And again, what our farmers do, when they put their ewes in their paddocks for lambing, if there are some paddocks where there's not much feed, they put the single-bearing ewes in those ones, which is common because we never have enough feed in lactation. A thing that has really changed in New Zealand in the last 5 or so years is management of the ewe after weaning. We often think about the lamb after weaning, but today I'm focusing on the ewe. But what our farmers are increasingly doing at weaning is condition scoring the ewes, and rather than just having them in one mob post-weaning up until the next breeding, they're having them in 2 to 3 mobs based on their body condition score. Those that are in good condition, they're just given maintenance feed over summer because they don't need any more food. Those that are in thin condition or low body condition are fed slightly more because they're going to have to gain 5 to 7 kilos before next breeding. And you need 2 or 3 months to do that. So by splitting them into 2 or 3 mobs, the total feed that flock eats is no different, but you're just giving the food to those that need it most and controlling the others. So again, that's targeted feeding. And doing it that way, you'll increase your lambing percentage the next year rather than grazing them as one mob, because the thin ewes stay thin and the fat ewes stay fat if you just have them as one mob. Increasingly also in the last 5 or so years, farmers are realising that their ewes cannot eat enough ryegrass, white clover and lactation to produce a lot of milk. So what about some other feeds, other plants? And I'm only going to have 2 quick slides on that, but I could have a whole talk on that. But I know this also occurs in Uruguay. Plants like plantain, chicory, red and white clover are being grown together as a way to increase ewe milk production, lamb survival, lamb growth, and the weight of the ewe at weaning herself, so she's better next year. And we're seeing a lot more of that. A lot of farmers are putting their triplet-bearing ewes, improving lamb survival by 10 or 15%, total weight of lamb weaned per ewe, 8 to 10 kilos more, and the ewe in better performance. They're either lambing on those feeds or a few weeks after lambing, walking the ewes and their lambs onto those feeds. There's other feeds as well, but I'll just touch on those ones. I wanted to show this photo because it was talked about a little bit yesterday. I think in the past we used to work in isolation, but when we developed that chicory, plantain, red and white clover mix, we had animal scientists working on it from an animal point of view. In the research team, we had veterinarians ensuring there were not any animal health implications. We had agronomists working out what's the best way to graze the plant so the plant survives and produces the most. And here is our artificial sheep, the lawnmower, looking at different grazing heights and frequencies to make sure the plant grows as much as it can and stays in your farming system for many years. And the other important member of that research team was the sheep. We had a whole lot of plants. We tested 10 plants, and we had sheep indoors, and we gave them different combinations. And we let them tell us what plants they wanted to eat. And that's how we came up with that mix and the different percentages. If you want your cart or your boat to go fast, you put the right fuel in it. If you want your animals to perform well, you've got to put the right fuel in it and let them choose. So that project involved a range of scientists, but also the sheep told us, instead of us deciding, like we do at the moment, telling the sheep what they should do. So I just wanted to touch on that because it's a thing that's often forgotten. I want to change and talk about now ewe lambs. We call them hoggets, bred in New Zealand at 8 to 9 months of age. About 30% of our ewe lambs in New Zealand are bred. A lot of research in the last 15 years in New Zealand has been focused on that. And again, I could talk all day about that. There's a book that we've written for farmers, and it's also free on the internet, a PDF, and that's the address with the guidelines. But I just want to focus on nutrition, because nutrition in this talk is the thing that underlines the success of breeding ewe lambs. It's the only thing you need to get right. There's a lot of other factors, but in reality, feeding. This graph is based on 14,000 ewe lambs on a number of farms where we monitored them at breeding, and it's the relationship between live weight and fertility. And from that, you can see you want to be a minimum of 40 kilos with our breed types to get at least 80% pregnant at 8 months of age. Now, there's a speaker yesterday that said we shouldn't talk about different breeds. We should talk about genotypes, which is correct. And therefore, that 40 kilos may be irrelevant depending on what type of sheep you have. What's really important is what percentage that weight is at 8 or 9 months of age of their mature weight. So in those 14,000 ewe lambs, we followed them for 3 more years and weighed them at 3 years of age, and then we could produce the same graph of their percentage of mature weight at 8 months of age, and their performance. So if you know what your mature weight of your ewe flock is, you can calculate there that they need to be about 70% of their mature weight. Okay, so for a given sheep type, you could work that out, and therefore you could have your target weight. We've also done that with those 14,000 animals and across those commercial farms, the effective body condition score on performance as well. In all mammals, puberty occurs when you switch from laying protein or muscle to laying fat. Your physiology changes. That's how the body knows a female is starting ready to reproduce. Therefore, it's not surprising that body condition score is a good indicator or trigger when a young female is going to become reproductive. She might be heavy, but if she's lean, her body will not think that she is ready. So body condition score is actually your best measure of when a female is ready to reach puberty and breed. The thing that's pivotal about breeding ewe lambs is making sure you feed her enough. With our mature ewes, we know in pregnancy we only need to feed them for the fetus. But with a ewe lamb, we have to feed for the fetus and allow her to grow as well, because you don't want to stunt her and limit her future performance. So the biggest failure that New Zealand farmers have when they're breeding ewe lambs is not feeding them enough in pregnancy. Many farmers think, if I get her to 40 kilos, I've won. It is going to work. If you get her to 40 kilos and you don't feed her well enough in pregnancy, you will lose the race. And so feeding in pregnancy is pivotal, and is the main reason why most of our farmers don't breed ewe lambs, is because on our farms we don't have enough grass in winter to feed the mature ewes enough for pregnancy, plus feed the ewe lambs that are pregnant as well. So if you're going to get ewe lambs pregnant, you must have enough feed. And you can work that out with some basic calculations, and I've just used New Zealand data. If the ewe lamb was 40 kilos the day she went to the ram, she needs to gain 10 kilos of her own weight in pregnancy, plus 10 kilos for the pregnancy, which is the placenta, the fetus, and the fluids, which gets her to 60 kilos the day before she lambs. The day after she lambs, she'll lose that 10 kilos of fluid, fetus, and placenta, and she'll be back at 50 kilos. So if she's got to gain 20 kilos in total in pregnancy, she needs to gain 135 grams per day throughout pregnancy, and that is hard. And that is why most of our farmers don't breed hoggets, or they only do it once, because they fail to do this. The lambs don't survive, the ewe lamb is small, and her future performance is bad, and she doesn't last as long in the flock. And just to give you an example, here's a graph of 4,000 ewe lambs. This is their weight the week before lambing. This is the chance that their lamb dies. The lighter she is the week before lambing, the greater the chance her lamb dies. And if you want 10 or 20% only to die, which would be average, which would be a good target, she needs to be 55 to 60 kilos with our sheep. Okay, that's just a fact. And that's why breeding ewe lambs is so difficult. And I wouldn't advocate someone breeding ewe lambs unless they've already got high performance out of their mature twin and triplet bearing ewes. Get that right first, then move on to the extra lambs out of ewe lambs. Otherwise, you might just end up with a disaster. And therefore, with ewe lambs, because they have to eat so much, a number of studies have shown you just can't restrict their intake in pregnancy. Early pregnancy is about them growing. So she grows and she's structurally big, and therefore she can give birth to that lamb. Late pregnancy is about the fetus growing and the mammary gland developing. And increasingly, we're seeing farmers who breed their ewe lambs or hoggets are using those alternative herbages because they're struggling to achieve those targets on grass alone. if you do it right, you feed them to be within 4 kilos at 18 months of age, what they should be if they were non-pregnant or lactating as a lamb, then their lifetime performance, in a number of studies, we've collected the data, we've shown is improved. Soon as they're getting more than 5 kilos behind, their lifetime performance is worse, and you lose any benefit of that extra lamb in that first year. It is simple as that. What I wanted to focus for the last 5 or so minutes is a little bit on ensuring technologies get to farmers. And Javier touched on it in the previous talk, because a lot of the information that I've given today, some of you have heard 10, 20 years ago. Our farmers had heard 10 or 20 years ago. But some of them are still not addressing the problems. So we still have problems getting information to farmers and getting farmers to make changes. So in New Zealand, there's a lot of research at the moment about how to get farmers to take up technology and how to make the research relevant for farmers. At our university, we have what we call a farmer learning group, and that's 30 farmers that have been coming to the university for the last 4 years, 4 times a year. And it has been around the issue of alternative herbages, the chicory, the plantain, clovers. That's been the scientific topic. But what we've been doing as scientists, we've been working with educationalists from the university, sociologists, to work with the farmers, to understand with the farmers how they like to learn, how information is most suitable for them, so they can then go make changes on their farm. And there's a lot of activities that go on. You know, there's farmers here looking at some basic research in a glass house, looking at growing the plant. We were talking about worms, drenching, but we actually got some ewes that were heavily parasitised. We slaughtered them and we looked at the worms so the farmers could understand and see the damage. We talked about how to treat them. We talk in the paddock on the research farm. But then we importantly, and I'll come back to this, go to the farmer's farm and see him or her using our technology and how they've adapted it to suit their needs. And of course, we socialise with the farmers. And then people are more likely to speak when they are drinking. So there's different activities. And the sociologists and the educationalists interview the farmers all the time, both during these sessions and at their own homes, to find out what they liked and what they didn't like, so that we can target our messages. And this is called a network analysis. To me, it looks like a lot of dots. But the black dots are the scientists. The green dots are all the sociologists, educationalists, psychologists that have been working with the farmers. And the blue dots are 19 of the farmers. The lines in between, we asked the farmers at the beginning, name the people that you know in this group. And those lines, if there's a line between 2 dots, it means you know that person. After 1 year, after learning about the alternative herbages, taking on messages, the educationalists went and surveyed the farmers and said, in the last year, as a farmer, list all the farmers that you've now given advice to based on what you've learnt. And those 19 farmers in 1 year had talked to 223 of their neighbours, or their neighbours had asked them for advice based on what they had learnt, showing the importance of the farmer being the trainer of the other farmer. And when this educationalists and psychologists interviewed the farmers, and they said, why do you do this? The farmers said, we like to see the science that the scientists are doing. It is good, but what they do won't work exactly the same on my farm. But if I see another farmer has adapted it for his farm, and it's working on his farm, I now have the confidence to do it on my farm. So increasingly, we're using what we would call farmers as the trainers of other farmers. So it's being smart about getting the messages across. Not just relying on a scientist like me talking like a scientist. You need that in combination with a farmer talking about a farmer like a farmer based on his experiences and how he's adopted the science. Once we started to see this, we thought, well, let's ask other farmers what they think. So we surveyed 1,000 farmers. So we got results back from 1,000 farmers. So it's a lot of farmers did a survey. It was an anonymous survey, so they could say what they like. We asked them what research they would like us to undertake, rather than us as scientists or us as the industry telling them what we should do. That has two advantages. One is it tells us what needs to be done, but just as importantly, it tells us that if there's a topic in there that farmers are saying needs to be researched, but it has been researched, it tells us we've done a poor job of spreading that message. And rather than doing more research, we just need to get a better way of getting that message out there. So there's two advantages to knowing that. We also asked them, where do they get their information from, in what format, and what's most useful, rather than us thinking we know. The number one from those 1,000 farmers, the number one source of useful information was farmers. Number two was veterinarians. Scientists were in the middle. Farm consultants were at the bottom because they think farm consultants are trying to sell something, so they're biased. They also told us that they like a mix of information sources. Now, they like books or one-page bits of papers. They like field days. They like a mix of activities, not just one, because they like to take time to understand the message rather than just hearing it once and making a decision. So now we can target the way we get the message across. And also we asked them what tools they're using, or more importantly, not using. Because if I stand up in front of farmers and say use pregnancy scanning, and 20% aren't, it is a waste of their time and my time to talk about guidelines based on pregnancy scanning. So we need to know what tools they're using so that we can tailor our message. And if they're not using those tools, we ask them to tell us why not. Is it because those tools are not relevant, not suitable for farming, or too expensive, so we can make changes? So this work is recent work, but we're trying to make changes so that we can maximize the benefit of the research we do. Because there's never enough money to do all the research we want to do, and we want to make changes on farms. And we know, if we're honest, that there's been a lot of good research, and it was talked about yesterday from the 1960s and 70s, that's still not been taken up by farmers. So we're still not getting the messages out there. So we've got some work to do there. And I don't think we can rely on scientists. We have to work with people who deal with education, sociology, who understand learning. We think we know, but we don't know what we don't know. Just two more slides. Our current focus with high-producing flocks, multiple-bearing ewes, ewe lambs, is looking at increasing longevity now. We believe in New Zealand. We know the feeding guidelines. We know the body condition score guidelines. Now we want to make sure that ewe stays in our flock for a long time. Just like what Sue said, the longer she stays in the flock, the more productive and more efficient she is. So that's a lot of our research. And because now wool only makes up 5 to 10% of the income for our sheep farmers, it's about selling meat. What drives meat is milk. So how can we maximize the milk production of our ewes from a lamb survival and lamb growth point of view? So that's now the focus. You start to see the research in New Zealand. So in conclusion, it's about targeted feeding if you want high performance, because you'll never have enough food. It's about knowing which ones need it the most and which ones need it the least, and feeding those groups separately, so you maximize your response. Breeding new lambs can be a way of increasing productivity, but it costs a lot of food. So if you're going to try to breed new lambs, you need to ensure that you've got that level of feeding available. And also, and the last point is there is no one silver bullet. It's a lot of factors that you have to get together to get high performance. And you have to combine those factors. And I've just touched on feeding and body condition score, but we've heard about genetics and other factors as well. Thank you for your time.